This section is about the oil tanks. Why did Chris put his daughters in oil tanks? A lot of people have wondered about this. For me, it's by far the most disturbing, barbaric, and evil part of the crime. To me, it's actually worse than the actual murder itself. To put your own children in oil tanks, that is by far the worst part of this crime. And no one can tell me that Chris Watts is innocent knowing that fact. We will never know exactly why he discarded his family the way he did, but people who commit crimes, people who murder, tend to bury their victims in places that they're familiar with. And Chris Watts buried his family, essentially, or placed his family in a place he was familiar with, which is where he worked as a field coordinator or whatever. And so he was familiar with that place. And I think that he wanted to get his family as far away from the house as possible. He didn't want people, sniffing around and, finding them on the property. So he wanted to get them as far away as possible within reason, within distance, within knowledge. So he was familiar with the place that he dumped his family. I think he essentially put the girls in oil tanks because he was in a probably flight or fight mode, that he was panicked. And when you're panicked, you don't always, your brain doesn't always cooperate with you. I think that he took time to bury Shan'Ann. Shan'Ann couldn't fit in the oil tanks as easily, obviously. She would have been far heavier and it would have been far harder for Shan'Ann to fit in those oil tanks. And I think it was a case of, burying his children, digging more holes to bury his children would have taken up more of his time. And I think he probably thought to himself that no one would have looked in the oil tanks. So essentially their bodies would never have been found. I don't think he wanted his family ever to be found. I think that was the perfect scenario for him, for his family never to be found. So I think with his daughters, I think it was just a matter of panicking, feeling pressure in terms of time, not wanting to be bothered to dig more holes to bury them. And I think that's the case. But then there's the other question of why did he put them in separate oil tanks? And I think that he put them in separate oil tanks probably because he didn't want them, if they were ever going to be found, he didn't want them to all be found together. In his disturbed and very sick mind, he thought that if he placed them in 3 different places, that he didn't want for them to be found and the puzzle to be solved right away. So in his mind, in his jumbled, disordered, disturbed mind, he thought that separating the bodies would make it harder if they were found for the puzzle to be solved. So yeah, he didn't want to bury them on the property because, just in case sniffer dogs came around, he wanted to bury them away from himself in terms of where he was residing, far away from the house, but still in a location that he was familiar with. And he probably thought no one would ever dig up the work site to look for any bodies. No one would have thought that any bodies would be, in an oil tank. So I think in his mind, he thought this is a good place to get rid of them. No one will find them. No one will even think that they would be here at where I work. But people might think that they're buried in my home. So let me just get them away from me as far as possible, but still place them in an area where he's familiar with. But yeah, the oil tank part of the crime, I think, is by far the most disturbing, by far the most compelling, by far the most evil, and tells me that he did not care about his family in the end at all. There's been questions as to whether Shan'Ann did this. There's no possibility that Shan'Ann could have done any of this. Shan'Ann was absolutely the victim in all of this. the girls were victims, and Shan'Ann was just somebody who had no idea what was in store for her. Shan'Ann would never have hurt her children. Shan'Ann loved her children. But I do think that Shan'Ann made one big mistake, and I think that she didn't pick up on the very subtle signs that she was going to get discarded. Now, there's no way she could have thought that she was going to be murdered. But I think Chris did a lot of things leading up to the murder, where he showed where he was disinterested in the marriage and distancing himself from her. And because she was so desperate to hold on and keep her family together, she was first confused. She was confused, desperately looking for answers. She didn't know what was going on with Nicole Kessinger. She didn't know that he'd already checked out of the marriage. So she was confused, anxiety-ridden, emotionally distraught. She was being gaslighted. He was distancing himself from her emotionally. He didn't want to touch her. And unfortunately, she didn't pick up on those subtle signs that I need to get out of this situation. I'm not safe. But she was never to know. She was never to know what he was going to do. I mean, no one could have predicted that he would have taken the actions that he did. But when you have an affair, you have financial problems, and you have a toxic family, all of this just came to a halt in this murder. And for me, by far, what seals the deal for me in terms of realizing that Chris is a very evil person is the fact that he put his own kids in oil tanks. And for me, it's by far the most disturbing part of this case. Not only that, it's what makes people still fascinated with this case to this day. The fact that he did that to his own children. Over the past 2 months, Chris Watts has been the most viewed content on this channel. And when I started getting a little bit of momentum, it was from the Lori Vallow case. I no longer cover that case as a criminal case anymore because I'm very angry with that case. But I will be covering it in the future. Not as a crime case, but as a personality disorder case. But the Chris Watts case has really been the case that a lot of people are still interested in. So I've decided to give you an edited version of my full Chris Watts podcast with many, many bonus features, including a mental health evaluation on Cindy Watts, which will be included in this bonus feature. I also want to say that there is a lot of untruths about the Chris Watts case floating around on YouTube. The idea that people are going to get arrested, that Nicole Kessinger is going to be arrested. It's all lies to get views and to lure you in. And if Nicole Kessinger was going to be arrested for this crime, she would have been arrested a long time ago, I can tell you that. Also, Shan'Ann Cadle has told a lot of lies. I think that she's told some truths about her relationship and the breakdown of her relationship with the Watts family. But I absolutely believe that Shan'Ann Cadle is all about ka-ching on the Chris Watts case. And I think she's told a lot of untruths. One of the untruths and lies that she told not long ago is that Nicole Kessinger, her arrest was imminent. And that time came and went and there was no arrest. There's not going to be an arrest for Nicole Kessinger in terms of the Watts crime, because whether you like it or not, it's a closed case. Even the CBI agents have said it's a closed case. People pretend that it's still open, and people pretend that there's still an open investigation to lure you in, to deceive you, and to get views. Now, my most viewed podcast segment on this channel is something on Cindy Watts, and it's called Cindy Watts Still Blames Shan'Ann. That's just hit 10K views, and I am going to put it into this podcast, and I'm also going to put it as a follow-up podcast. So, Cindy Watts and the Chris Watts family, I think they still put a lot of blame on Shan'Ann. And it's never, ever his fault. You know, they will live in eternal denial about his involvement. I've always believed that Chris Watts is solely and wholly responsible for this crime. And I've never, ever believed that anyone else was involved. And until I see proof that anyone else was involved, and I'm open to evidence. Until I see evidence or proof that someone else is involved, I will never believe it. And I believe that he's a sociopath. I think he's a narcissist. And I think he really, really felt trapped in that marriage in the end. I think Nicole Kessinger was certainly the catalyst. But I think he knew that he couldn't leave that marriage without getting rid of his family. I think that was his position, because he was going to be financially drained if he left that marriage in the viable way. And that was to divorce Shan'Ann. You know, he just couldn't afford a divorce. So he got rid of his family the way he did. And I think he's pure evil. And I don't think he's ever going to get a 35C, and I don't think he's ever going to be released. I think that this is a very, very dangerous person. I think that his mother's treatment of him, in terms of putting him on a pedestal and trying to make people believe that he's the nicest, most kindest, most wonderful person, Chris. You're just the most wonderful person. You were the kindest person that there ever was. Well, people who are nice and kind don't cheat on their pregnant wives. People who are good and decent don't bury their family in oil tanks on their work site and deceive the public in the way he did. This case is the most popular true crime case on YouTube. Not in the world, but on YouTube. And so I'm giving you what you want. Because like I said, for the past few months, people have said to me, oh, you're obsessed with the Watts case. You're obsessed. It's not me that's obsessed, really. Yes, I have a slight obsession with it. But when I go into my analytics, I see that my most viewed content is on Chris Watts. So that's why I'm giving you now the full podcast. You can listen to this while you sleep or while you nap. You can listen to this in the car. You can listen to this while you're doing housework, while you're cooking. And I hope you enjoy it. Cindy Watts, mental health and personality factors. After assessing Cindy Watts, i.e. watching interviews, listening to audio recordings, studying her body language, it's very apparent to me that Cindy Watts has both narcissistic and sociopathic traits. And unfortunately, Chris Watts inherited these traits and was nurtured within this very toxic environment. I cannot entirely blame her for what he did. After all, his sister Jamie was raised in the same household with the same parents, and she has never committed this type of crime. So I cannot blame the Watts entirely for how Chris turned out. However, it's no surprise that he did turn out the way he did. There is no doubt in my mind that Cindy Watts was a malignant influence in her son's life, and in his marriage, extremely toxic. I don't believe his emotional needs were ever met. I believe that Cindy Watts projected her desire for perfection and achievement onto her son in order to satisfy her own narcissistic needs. As a consequence, Chris grew up to be this very vacant human being with no genuine personality of his own. You can see that even now. He's quoting Bible scripture and pretending he is a man of God. He's simply just wearing another mask. He's just trying to resurrect his good guy image, and it's all just a manipulation strategy to get himself out of prison. Now, I intend to be fair and balanced in my assessment. This is not my attempt to paint Cindy Watts in a negative light or a positive light, but instead I want to be objective. It seems fair to say that Cindy Watts raised Chris to be ambitious, to have a strong work ethic. It would appear that Cindy Watts worked hard all her life and had a strong work ethic herself. Chris Watts inherited this work ethic. he was educated, and he worked hard. Because of this, he was able to hide behind the mask of being an upstanding citizen. He looked good on paper. His in-laws bought into his facade, and he was easily able to manipulate his parents and everyone else around him, and continues to do so even now. The key to understanding Cindy Watts is that she doesn't care about facts or logic. She's not seeking truth. Although she pretends that she wants to know the truth, in reality, she cannot handle the truth. She will ultimately always revert back to denial, and denial has turned to delusion. The delusion that Chris Watts is innocent because she can't live with the shame of what her golden boy did. She refuses to see him as anything less than perfect. This is not about loving her son so much as it is that she idealizes him. This idealization of her son is required for narcissistic fuel, needing to admire the reflection of the glowing image she has of herself as a mother. If you recall in her first interview, Cindy makes a lot of petty comments about Shan'Ann and what she said about Chris that she didn't like. That's because Cindy viewed her son as close to perfection and resented the fact that Shan'Ann found any flaws in Chris. She took any criticism of Chris by Shan'Ann as a direct offense, a personal insult on the glowing image she has of herself as a mother. That's because she sees Chris not only as an extension of herself, but also a reflection of her own image. That image needs to stay perfect. In idealizing Chris, she continues to devalue Shan'Ann even in death, also for narcissistic supply. In her mind, Shan'Ann has to be seen in a negative light so that Chris's light can shine brighter. With narcissistic people, you will often find that for them, a person is either all good or all bad, and there are no shades of grey. In the same vein, she sees her son as the victim, and she sees Shan'Ann as the perpetrator. Image and reputation is the biggest concern for Cindy Watts. She doesn't want her family name and reputation to be attached or linked to the crimes that her son committed. Therefore, Shan'Ann is the convenient scapegoat, the fall guy. After finding out, as I suspected, that Cindy Watts is actually the driving force behind all the channels that are accusing Shan'Ann of wrongdoing, she wanted this negative narrative of Shan'Ann to be put out there. In an updated audio recording, Cindy Watts is heard saying that she wants her son to get a new trial, but he never had a trial to begin with. Therefore, he cannot get a new trial. She talks about how an appeal needs to happen, and she talks about how she urged Kim Kaufman to put in quotes, stuff out there. So all of the victim blaming of Shan'Ann that is featured on that channel and others has all been created with the urging of Cindy Watts and co. She wants people to believe that her son is innocent and that Shan'Ann is the perpetrator, because that aligns perfectly with her narrative. And from day one, she has been victim blaming. She sees her son as the victim. Indeed, Cindy Watts needs people to believe that her son is innocent. The more people she can manipulate into believing that her son is the victim, the more narcissistic supply and hopeful she feels about getting him out of prison. Cindy Watts falls into the classic category of a narcissistic mother. She felt threatened by her son's growing independence. She wanted to possess and control him. She didn't go to his wedding, making it clear that she did not approve of his wife. These are the 5 signs that Cindy Watts has both narcissistic and sociopathic traits. I believe in quality over quantity in making these points. So, lack of empathy. Lack of empathy for her daughter and grandchildren. The examples can be seen in her interviews and audio recordings where she talks very little about her grandchildren. And she has nothing positive to say about Shan'Ann and speaks about her with utter contempt and resentment. Lack of a conscience. It's one thing for Cindy Watts to be so deluded that she thinks her son is the victim, but it's another thing entirely to hold on to such resentment, to still have this simmering resentment and bitterness towards her daughter-in-law, more than 2 years after her death, still blaming Shan'Ann. That's not just lack of empathy, but a total lack of a conscience. Manipulation. So over the past 2 years, Cindy Watts has tried to manipulate people into believing that Shan'Ann was harming her children, providing no evidence to back up her claims. One of her big lies is that trying to convince people that Shan'Ann wasn't allowed to be alone with her children. This is one of many lies Cindy Watts has told, purely designed to vilify for Shan'Ann and garner sympathy for Chris. Playing the victim while blaming the real victim. So narcissistic people are very good at playing victim while blaming the real victim. It's part of their manipulation strategy, but it also feeds into Cindy's need to maintain the good guy image of her son. For Cindy Watts, her son is the victim in all of this. So when people express outrage at her insensitive comments about Shan'Ann, she cries victim in order to deflect the blame and to shift the blame onto Shan'Ann once again. Cold and calculated. Cindy Watts has tried to create her own fantasy theory of this crime, and this make-believe version, Chris Watts, is totally innocent. In fact, once again, Shan'Ann is to blame, and she continues to stir the pot she has been stirring for over 2 years. You have to be pretty cold and calculated to continue pointing the finger at an innocent victim, despite your son's obvious guilt. But she doesn't care about his guilt at all. The truth doesn't matter to Cindy Watts. What matters most is that her family image is redeemed, Chris is vindicated, and Shan'Ann remains the villain. So I could never do this podcast without putting a section in about Nicole Kessinger. I mean, Nicole Kessinger has been a scapegoat. A lot of the blame has been put on her. People use her image to get views. I've never done that. I have no hatred towards Nicole Kessinger whatsoever. I don't blame her for what happened. I do believe that she's a major catalyst for the reason that Chris Watts annihilated his entire family. But I've seen no evidence that she was involved at all. And that's not a popular opinion. It's just my opinion. And until somebody can show me evidence that she was involved, I'll never believe it. A lot of people still believe that she's going to get arrested at some point and that she's going to be charged, with conspiracy to commit murder. And that's a pure fantasy. It's never going to happen. I do agree when people say that she should have been looked into a lot closer. I think they should have given her a lie detector test. I agree with that. And I do think that she told some false, I do think she told some lies. But I don't believe that she would. I think Chris Watts planned this in secret without telling anyone. I think he was a very secretive person. I think there's a lot going on upstairs with Chris Watts. There was a lot going on in his mind. And Nicole Kessinger was simply the better option. He could get rid of his family. He could be with Nicole. He wouldn't have to answer to anybody. He wouldn't have to pay child support. He wouldn't have to pay Shan'Ann anything. He wouldn't have to split anything in half. His family were a burden to him, and they were an obstacle in the way of getting what he wanted, which is ultimately Nicole Kessinger and financial freedom. And his family, were just an obstacle in his way. And he ultimately discarded his family because he wanted what he wanted. He didn't want his family anymore. He wanted Nicole Kessinger, and he wanted financial freedom. And with Shan'Ann and the girl still being alive, he would have not been financially free. They were already in debt, and his financial situation would have been really bad had he divorced Shan'Ann. He admitted himself that they couldn't afford certain things. He hasn't gone into detail about their financial situation on any vocal interview, but he had hinted that neither of them could afford to live on their own. So, he got rid of his family ultimately because Nicole Kessinger was the better option. So this segment is about Nicole Kessinger because I couldn't do a Chris Watts podcast without mentioning her. This is part 3 of my Chris Watts 2 Years On podcast. And this segment is going to discuss this idea that many people still believe that Nicole played a greater role. Some even believe she was the mastermind.
I'm going to start this discussion by saying I don't believe there is any evidence to support NK's involvement, and I'll be calling her NK from now on, I think. But I will discuss some of the reasons why people think she should have been charged also. As everyone who followed this case knows, NK was a co-worker of Chris Watts. They began an affair some weeks or months leading up to the murders. I do believe that Nicole was a catalyst for the murders and the reason why he ultimately made the decision to annihilate his family. But I don't believe she was the sole reason for the murders. I believe that Chris Watts was battling one major life stressor, and that was financial burden, bankruptcy, and debt. I'm not going to go into detail about finances or place blame on anyone in particular. That's not what this discussion is about. But I do believe Chris Watts was frustrated and highly stressed about his finances. Added to that, he was finding fulfillment outside of his marriage. NK was an outlet. I think he was idealizing Nicole the way he may have idealized Shan'Ann when he started dating her. He was in this financial hellhole with 3 children to support when you include their unborn son. Chris Watts was no longer getting the narcissistic fuel he needed to have the desire to continue in his marriage. Being married to Shan'Ann and continuing to be in debt wasn't a desirable option for him. They had already filed for bankruptcy once. There was a dark shadow lingering of financial ruin. Not an attractive option, especially when you have a new woman to entertain. So he's got this new woman who's providing him with the narcissistic supply that he wants. A woman who provides him with stimulation and who he's not actually financially obligated to. So he's just getting enjoyment and fulfillment out of being with Nicole. And he's no longer getting that with Shan'Ann. So I don't describe to this notion of the evil, scheming seductress who made the good guy turn on his family. That's a cop-out. That is just an excuse for his despicable behavior and his despicable crime. Okay, so I'm going to cite some of the reasons why people think that Nicole Kessinger was involved, NK. Why people think that she was involved or the orchestrator of this crime. So it has been said that Nicole looked at Shan'Ann's Facebook page. People cite this as a reason for her guilt. Makes no sense to me whatsoever. It's only natural to be curious about the wife of the man you're having an affair with. To seek out your competition. That's all she was doing. Doesn't mean that she was plotting a murder against Shan'Ann just because she looked at her Facebook page. Lots of people look at other people's Facebook pages for a variety of different reasons. It doesn't provide evidence that she was plotting a murder. Some people say her Google searches, people say her Google searches support this claim that she, might have been involved. It doesn't. It came to light that she was looking at wedding dresses. Once again, does not count as any evidence, particularly if she believed Chris when he told her that he was separating from his wife. NK was 30. Only natural for her to be thinking about a life with Chris Watts if she was in a relationship with him and if he was telling her that he would eventually separate from his wife and get a divorce. The fact that she was Googling adult websites, once again, means nothing. Millions of people view adult websites on a monthly basis. That doesn't provide evidence that she planned this murder or orchestrated this murder. Doesn't provide any evidence at all. It come to light that she Googled how much money Amber Fry got for her book deal. I think this tells you a lot about her lack of empathy, possible narcissism, how self-absorbed she is. But once again, it does not provide evidence of a murder plot. People have said her phone pinged near the Watts house on the night of the murder. That doesn't mean she had anything to do with the planning or execution of the crime. NK lived and worked in Colorado. It's not as if she lived in another state and just happened to be in Colorado on the night. People cite her communication with Chris Watts on the day of the murder. Means nothing either. She was having an affair with him, so the fact they spoke on the day of the crime doesn't provide evidence that she was scheming with him to get rid of his family. People have cited her eagerness to delete her texts and emails as evidence she's hiding something. Well, she was indeed hiding something. She sent Chris numerous raunchy photographs of herself, and many of their conversations were adult or mature in nature. So it's no surprise that she wouldn't want strangers looking at her provocative photographs. If NK had been at the house that night, the neighbour's camera would have shown that. She was not seen on any camera, and there is no evidence that anyone else was at the crime scene. There is also no correspondence between NK and Watts about the murder. Killing, bodies, nothing like that. There is no mention of murder, murders plural, killing bodies, hiding bodies, disposing of bodies. There's absolutely no correspondence or communication of any murder plot whatsoever between Nicole Kessinger and Chris Watts. Neither does her Google searches provide evidence that she was looking at anything sinister or to do with a crime. Nicole Kessinger might be shallow, she may lack empathy, she might even be a narcissist. But there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that she was involved. I'm actually preparing another episode of the Lori Vallow podcast. However, some things are really getting under my skin, and I feel it's time for another episode on Watts. So back to Chris Watts, the covert narcissist. I'm going to explore what I feel are the key points that make him a covert and how this enabled him to commit this horrific crime. Now, I was just looking through some comments on another channel, and this creator, who I won't name, said he thinks Chris Watts is the most remorseful killer. He believes that Chris Watts is remorseful partly because he cried. I don't believe that Chris Watts is remorseful at all. And I don't think he's remorseful because I don't think he feels empathy. I don't think he's capable of empathizing. His mind is so twisted. He doesn't really have a lot of depth. His personality kind of like runs on the surface. I call it a surface personality. A lot of coverts have this type of personality. There really isn't much substance. They kind of just mimic. And that's why when Chris Watts was saying how much he missed his family, as he was pleading for their safe return, saying how much he wanted them to come home, many people who observed him didn't believe him because he didn't have the empathy in order to convey true emotion. His affect was very flat. Because basically, he was just mimicking and repeating what he thought he was supposed to say. And he was banking on the fact that he would be able to control the narrative of this loving father who was concerned about his family. Another point I want to address, this creator also believes that narcissism has nothing to do with the crime that Chris committed. And while yes, I do believe we all have narcissistic traits, that's very different from being a true narcissist or having the disorder. Covert narcissists are the worst type of narcissist to get involved with. And the reason is because they are not grandiose. Many are quiet and introverted, even shy. They want the admiration. In fact, they secretly crave admiration. They are just not as vocal with their egos. Simply speaking, coverts are not easy to spot, and that is exactly why they are dangerous. If you can spot something early, you can get rid of it before it becomes toxic. But if you are none the wiser, then that leaves you vulnerable. Lots of people say that Shan'Ann was the narcissist. She wanted the big house, the flashy cars, the nice clothes. Shan'Ann's character is simply not important in all of this, because nothing that she did gave him the right to do what he did. Shan'Ann didn't have to be perfect, and she is the victim. And anyway, covert narcissists are the complete opposite of overts. And when discussing narcissism, I think it's important to distinguish the various subtypes. I don't think that Shan'Ann ever really got to know Chris, because the whole time they were together, up until the last few weeks, he was mimicking. He was wearing his mask. He was doing what he thought a loving father and husband is supposed to do, and he'd done that all throughout his life. His mother stressed education, success, working hard. Chris complied. He was compliant with his mother and her expectations until he met Shan'Ann. And when he was with Shan'Ann, he was compliant of her expectations. Chris Watts was never able to be himself. He was never being his true self. He was mimicking the entire time. So no one knew who he really was, not his family or Shan'Ann. Because if Shan'Ann had any inkling of who he was, she would not have stepped foot in the house on that fateful night. You know, lack of empathy is one of the most common traits of both narcissists and sociopaths. And for me, this is the key to unlocking the true nature of Chris Watts. His lack of empathy, his lack of regard, you know, to commit a crime like that and then to continue with your day as if nothing happened. How remorseful could he really have been? Shan'Ann had been devalued, gaslit, then discarded in the most barbaric way. It was the most extreme version of the narcissistic discard. But you know, what really makes him a narcissistic sociopath, because I think the psychopathy of him is really important to note. I think by far the worst thing that he did that truly shows how cold-hearted he is, which truly indicates that he had no empathy whatsoever, is that he tried to put the blame on Shan'Ann when given the opportunity, knowing full well she had nothing to do with it. That's how we know he has no empathy, doesn't care about anyone but himself. Chris Watts thought he was superior and better than his family, thought he was smarter than everyone else, and thought he could outsmart everyone else. When Chris asked to speak to his father, he did so because he knew his father didn't like Shan'Ann, and he knew he would be able to easily manipulate his father into believing him, because he thought he was superior. He thought he deserved better than what his wife and kids could give him. He was all about self-preservation. He didn't care about anyone. And that's the very definition of narcissism.